Hello, and welcome to Keep It Moving Wheelchair Maintenance and Repairs. I'm Brent, and today we'll be replacing the bearings from a 24-inch aluminum alloy wheelchair wheel. Now, since these have been in here for a while, they were a solid rubber tire that my nephew had that we're going to replace the tires onto. He hadn't used them in years, so they have been in here for quite a while. I did spray the inner bearing down there, the other side flat bearing. Let me flip it. I sprayed this one from the inside with some WD-40 to remove it. Now the reason you do want to replace the bearings is the fact that bearings, due to heat, will actually lose the oil from the grease, and as they start having the grease, the leftover parts of the grease start getting caked and they don't spin as well, you're going to have more rolling resistance from the bearings crunching, and that's just going to cause you issues. So we're going to replace these. I recommend replacing caster wheel bearings every 6 months, depending on where you live, if they get lots of salt and water, debris in them. Caster fork bearings every 6 to 12 months. And then rear rim bearings, since they're up above the water quite a bit, these you can probably go a year, but still if you live in a hot area or if you have hot summers, you splash water and especially salt from snow, these are still going to get pretty messed up. And today we're going to cover two different ways to remove the bearings. Part one of the first way is to use a punch pin to knock the bearing out from this side, the bearing that's flush on the other side. Then the other way is to use either a 5/8 spark plug socket or a longer socket. This is a 6-inch 5/8 socket to knock it out from here. Now I don't mind using sockets to knock these out. It knocks them out nice and even. And I don't mind damaging the old bearing because I do not repack the bearings. I've never found a way to be able to take the seal out, a seal that small, without damaging it, gouging it, which just makes the new grease run out. So I actually replaced the bearings. This is a set of 10 16/16 bearings, which is the bearing from this. You can actually see it there. 10 16/16 bearings, and I got this for $10 to $15. So I just replaced the bearings. Then we'll actually use a inexpensive $20 bearing extractor that you can actually get as a full kit for $50 if you want to do that. Now these punch pins, you can get 5 for $10 at Harbor Freight, $15 on Amazon if you don't have a Harbor Freight near you. And then I use a rubber double-ended mallet. I just use this to protect my ears. So we're going to come in here and we're going to work our way around on this bearing. I'm going to pull this out and show you something. This is a special table that I made, a little stand, and that is a 1 3/8 inch hole that I used a Forstner bit to drill, and then I used some sandpaper to make it just a little bit larger. The bearings will be able to drop out of that easily, plus I can stick caster forks, Tie-Lite Aero Z caster forks in there. This is a 3/4 inch hole that if you need to get this out of a bearing, you can actually drop that there. Now as I tap on that, you're going to notice that it's starting to come out. I am going to mute this for your ears when I do take some wax at this, because you do have to hit this with a little bit of force. I am smoothly working my way around instead of just pounding from one side. And I think the bearing just fell out. Yes, it did. Now one thing about this, you do want to clean these out when you're done with it and get any leftover gunk. When I did replace these years ago, I did use some grease, some marine grease in there. So that's still in there, luckily. And then this is the closest I'm ever going to come to being a basketball player. I actually just spin that on my finger. Get the old stuff out. So we just knocked the bearing out from the other side and cleaned it. So now we're actually going to knock this bearing out. So with this 5/8 inch socket, I can actually knock it enough room out to get it to come out of this side. If you do need a longer socket, this is only about 2¼ inches. You can actually use a 3-inch long version. So I actually used this special 5/8 inch socket that's 6 inches long that I put a table stopper or a table leg rubber piece on there. And the reason you have to use a 5/8 is you can find sockets that fit the bearing really well, but they won't be able to go through here. So I'm going to go ahead and knock the bearing out from this side, holding this nice and steady. Now we'll pause for a moment. We'll spin it. You notice it is starting to come out. I will go ahead and spray just a little bit of WD-40 in there. I'm feeling it come out a lot quicker. The WD-40 is helping. And there it goes. So both bearings have came out. Now I'll clean out the inside of this. Now if you use anything that's like a solvent, like a degreaser, make sure you clean this out thoroughly when you're done, because you don't want degreaser in there when you put bearings in that have grease in them. Okay. Clean this up. Okay. So I got most of that cleaned, but let's go ahead and use a little bit of alcohol on there too. I already did it on the shallow side, but now let's do it on the deep side. Okay. Now we have both of these nice and clean. Now to replace the bearing, you can either get this bearing press kit that's from Amazon. It's got a ton of different bearing drifts. That's what these are called, bearing press drifts. These are for the 6001 bearings, which are a 12 by 28 bearing. So the inner piece is 12, where a ½ inch is closer to 13. So there's a tiny little play on the bearing, but it does have some 8mm bearings that you can use for caster wheels. It's also got your R6 bearing presses. This works really well if you're only going to be replacing caster wheel bearings and rear rims. Now, if you are going to replace your fork bearings, or you want a customized kit, this is the ½ inch kit that you get from wheelchairbearings.com, not sponsored. Comes with a piece of threaded rod, 5/16 threaded rod, a brass punch pin, 2 ½ inch bearing drifts, and then an extension to be able to get the deeper bearing in, and even a bearing extractor, which we'll try next. This bearing extractor, very important if you're going to replace your fork bearings, your caster fork bearings, because they're very difficult to get to, especially if you have the type that only comes out of the top. Keep an eye open for that video to come out shortly. So we're going to go ahead and use this kit right here to put the bearings back in. And so I'm going to thread the rod into here. And if this is the first time you see me, I do have essential tremors, so my hands shake just a little bit. So I'm going to put that on that side. And I will actually get 2 new bearings. So let's take, that one's got some lint in it from when I put it on my table. Okay, so I have my 2 new bearings, and what I'm going to do is grab a little bit of grease and just lightly grease the outside of the bearing. I'll actually put the grease on a toothbrush and just lightly brush the bearing. I'll actually spin it on here. You don't want to layer it up too thick. So I'm going to try and spread around evenly. Because you don't want the bearing to spin in its socket. You just want this to make it easy to get in and to get out. If you have mixed metals like steel and aluminum, sometimes that can cause an issue. I'll actually put that right over that bearing drift. I'll do the same thing to this bearing. I'm just lightly brushing it on here, not caking it on. This makes the bearing easier to get into. I'll drop that on there. Try and wipe. Now, as you notice with these custom drifts, because you can't really find 1/2 inch inner race drifts besides from wheelchairbearing.com, you'll notice that they fit nice and snug on that inner race. The 12mm inner race ones that you get in bicycle kits, they'll just be a tiny bit loose, so they won't fit as snug as they go into the wheel. You may have to just make sure that they're aligned right. But let me go ahead, move this table to the side, and what I'll do is I'll take this extension piece, thread it through first, and then put this on. The reason I'm doing that is this longer piece here is to help this deeper bearing get all the way in. Then I'll pass this through, and notice that that bearing goes in very easily, so I do prefer to go with the longer one first. Then I'll grab this one and pop it on there, line that up, then hold this and then just thread this. I back thread just a tiny bit first before going forward because I don't want to cross thread this. We have that bearing in there. We got this one pushed in. I'll start to spin the handle. Occasionally you can spin a little faster. All right, now we're nice and snug. So I'm going to turn the right hand side. The right hand side has the bearing that's deeper. I'm going to turn this one first. And using these handles, you get a lot of purchase on it, so you don't need to turn this super hard to actually get these in. And you're just going to turn until that one stops. And what you're going to notice is the other side's going in too at the same time. So the left side's already in and sitting flush. You're just going to turn until it stops. There we go. It stopped on both sides. Then you just loosen it. You unspin the handle. And the nice thing about this one, since this bearing drift fits the inner race of the bearing perfect, I actually put both bearings in at the same time, because then I know they're not going in at any sort of angle. So I almost have the handle off. I'll take that bearing drift out. I'll pull this out. Then you just drop the bearing out there. Set those tools to the side. And as you see, there's 2 new bearings in here. Now this one takes 16/16 bearings. A lot of other rear rims and caster forks actually take R8 bearings. They're both 1/2 inch inner diameter inner races. So these will actually work on R8. Matter of fact, when you look this up, it'll say R8, but it also works on 16/16. The main difference between R8 and 16/16 is these bearings are a little thicker. They're thick boys. But that's how this rim's hub was designed. So I didn't want to put R8s in there, because then you'd have to make sure is the thickness, do you have it where it needs to be. So I'll spin this. As you see, there's bearings both in there. And since the race fits the bearing precisely on the outside, you notice that it pushed it in without damaging any part on the inside. Some people who use sockets to push in their bearings using a home vise, you can do that. You just have to have some sort of vise that would fit this. Otherwise, you have to take your hub off. And then you have to have a socket that fits that perfectly. So if you do have some sort of home press, you can use a 21 millimeter or a 13/16 socket to be able to press those in. I prefer to use that hand press. It's minimal tools. Any place that you have, you can actually do this in your apartment. I've done this on the floor on an old sheet at my nephew's place, and then right here in the laundry room of my building. So that was removing the bearing with minimal tools. A hole punch that you can get that would actually come with the kit, if you did get the kit, or you can buy it, a hammer, and then a 5/8 inch socket. You can get these in 3 inches pretty easy. If you did get one of these from your local store, look for the 6-sided version, not the 12-sided version. There's just a lot more metal there, and you're going to be pounding it out. This way, we're going to go ahead and remove this bearing on this side. And once again, I'll put a little bit of WD-40 in there because these are very old bearings in there. But this time, what we're going to do is we're going to use this bearing extractor. Now, in a bearing extractor, it spreads out from the inside of the inner race and gets in there. And so you just put it in there. I just had this tightened for another bearing removal, so I'll tap. The inside of these races have to be very clean. Otherwise, that bearing extractor just slips out from it. So we'll go ahead and use the punch that comes with the kit from wheelchairbearings.com. I'll line it up in the middle. You do want to make sure that you get that metal piece there, not the actual race itself. Let's see if that was the extractor that came out or the bearing. That was actually the extractor that came out because I did not clean the inside of that after I went ahead and used WD-40 on that bearing. So I'm going to wrap this up in here. I'll get it on the inside there, clean that out. So that just demonstrates that if you don't clean this, notice that there's some grease that came off on that. It just slips right out. I'm using alcohol so it goes away really quick. Now I'll also clean the outside of this gripper here. That was actually very shiny, so yeah, that was full of grease. Okay, now you have to loosen this. I do like this extractor a lot on caster forks, but I actually do not like it as much on rims, especially the deep side, because you have to do this multiple times. But it does pull it out pretty much perfectly straight. I'll pull this up, tighten the nut down, so I don't have to try and struggle with that as much. I do recommend at least an 8-inch crescent wrench on this. That way you can get some leverage. An 8-inch adjustable wrench. Then you tighten it down with a 1/2 inch closed-ended side. You can use 2 adjustable wrenches if you want. You do have to tighten this quite a bit. Now, removing the bearings like this on a caster fork, this is pretty much the only way you can get the first bearing out. But with these, I'd probably use the first way I showed you instead, because this is a pain. You have to constantly do that if it slips out. But it is non-destructive. So if you do want to try and remove this seal without damaging it, clean out the bearings, and then repack them with grease roughly 3/4 of the way, you can actually do that because it pulled these out from the inner race instead of damaging the bearings and the seals. in the way that I showed you with the socket. I'm going to go ahead and put the brass punch that comes with this kit. Try and center it directly on that little metal in the middle instead of hitting the outsides of it. Okay, let's check our progress. After we cleaned it, it looks like it's coming out now. You can see that there. So I'll flip it back over, and I think one more time we'll do it. Let's see, did the bearing come out? Yes, it did. There we go. So that's removing your bearings in a non-destructive way. Now, if you do want to use this, it'll take the bearings out in a non-destructive way. I actually put it in the middle of this bearing to show you. This was one of the bearings that I removed using the socket method. It did damage this seal. This seal seems to be actually metal that's in here. So getting the seal out, you could probably pull it out with a very small pick, but if you creased it or put any damage to the seal, it actually caused issues with this grease running out. So that's why I usually just replace the bearings. And it's very affordable to do. But if you do have the manual dexterity and a small enough pick, you may be able to get that metal seal. Some of those seals are rubber instead. But you can actually do that. Thanks for watching. Today we learned how to take rear rims and 2 different ways of removing the bearings, and then using either a bicycle bearing press kit or a bearing press kit you can get from wheelchairbearings.com to put your bearings back in. And we learned 2 different ways to actually take the old bearings out with a punch pin and a bearing extractor, or just the punch pin, and then for the long side, some sort of long socket. 5/8 inch works for me. Now, if you want to learn more, I'll actually attach the caster wheel bearing removal video, as well as how I made this table. That's a 1 3/8 inch hole that's slightly larger to make those bearings easily able to drop out, and a 3/4 inch hole that allows you, if your bearing extractor gets stuck in a bearing, you can actually knock it out from your bearing right here. Like, share, and subscribe to keep it moving wheelchair maintenance and repairs, where we make accessibility accessible. Thanks for watching.